Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Planning for Electric Vehicle Fast Charging Infrastructure Deployment with the eDrive Tool webinar. We're going to get started shortly, so thank you so much for joining us and for your patience, and we'll get started soon. All right, it looks like we're reaching critical mass here. We're at about 1 past the hour. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome again, everyone, to the Planning for Electric Vehicle Fast Charging Infrastructure Deployment with the eDrive Tool webinar. And thank you for joining the Georgetown Climate Center, MJ Bradley and Associates, and Ceres for this webinar today, which is a demonstration of the eDrive tool. It is an innovative nationwide online tool to inform the planning and implementation of electric vehicle or EV fast charging infrastructure deployment. I am Sarah Forney. I'm the Senior Manager for Clean Vehicles here at Ceres, and I am absolutely thrilled to be the moderator today for our webinar because it does really have significant implications for the strategic siting of new EV infrastructure, in particular in the US. So specifically, the eDrive tool enables local, state, and federal policymakers and planners, as well as businesses and local leaders, to identify and compare priority locations for EV fast charging infrastructure deployment using a wide range of customizable metrics and mapping filters. We really are at a pivotal moment today in history with transportation electrification. Emissions from the transportation sector are growing. The number of cars, and especially medium and heavy duty trucks on US roads, is multiplying exponentially, and we only have so much time to implement lasting solutions. This is actually a particularly crucial moment in terms of support from the federal government, as I'm sure that many of you are aware, as well as in the context of actions from key states and regions, as well as from businesses. From funding to strong vehicle standards and regulations at the state and the federal level to smart planning, we really need to get this right. And so the eDrive tool can help us put together some of these pieces to really inform and better plan for the future. Next slide. So we have a packed agenda for you all today. It will include background information and context on the eDrive tool and its development from its regional version, a live demonstration of how decision makers can use the tool under a few key example scenarios, and we'll end with an open Q&A for our expert speakers. Next slide. Just a few quick logistical notes before we get started. You are all muted today. And we also have a designated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but we will take any urgent questions periodically throughout the session. So you can submit any of those questions through the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of the screen at any time during the webinar. We do only have about an hour today, so apologies if we don't get to all of your questions during the call, but we will do our best to follow up on any remaining questions following the webinar. Also, just a quick reminder that if you are having audio issues, you can dial into the webinar using the phone number that's provided in your confirmation email. Now, as we jump into the webinar, I wanted to briefly introduce Ceres. If you aren't familiar with our work yet, we are a sustainability advocacy nonprofit working with companies and investors to help build leadership and drive clean energy and other sustainability solutions throughout the economy. And in particular, transportation electrification poses some really exciting opportunities for Ceres' partners, many of which are pushing to expand both, number one, supportive policies on clean transportation, and number two, market support for fleet electrification goals. And through our Corporate Electric Vehicle Alliance and our BICEP network, we're actively working with our partners to advocate for those solutions. So with that, I would like to introduce our expert speakers today who will be talking about the eDrive tool. First, starting with the picture below me, our speaker, Matthew Getz. He is an associate director of the mitigation program at the Georgetown Climate Center. Matthew develops legal and policy resources to advance state and federal climate policy, including white papers and analytical tools to support the strategic and equitable development of EV charging infrastructure. He also facilitates regional and multi-state policy development, including the Transportation Climate Initiative, or TCI, as you may have heard it called. On to our next speaker, Grace Van Horn is a principal consultant with MJ Bradley & Associates, which is an ERM group company. She provides clients with analysis of regulatory and policy initiatives on energy, climate change, transportation electrification, and electric reliability issues. And she manages the firm's EV mapping efforts and assists MJ Bradley clients and coalitions, including the Clean Energy Group, Energy Strategy Coalition, the Utility EVs Group, in evaluating and responding to environmental and energy policy issues. And last but certainly not least is Luke Helgren. He is also a principal consultant with MJ Bradley, and he provides strategic quantitative assessments of regulatory and policy initiatives on energy and climate issues. Luke also leads and contributes to the development of technical evaluations, spatial analyses, and dynamic tools that focus on emissions, costs, and trends in the power, transportation, and oil and gas sectors. So you are all in great hands today with these speakers. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Matthew Getz to get us started and provide some background on the tool and context on its development.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and thank you to Ceres for putting this webinar on, which we hope will be helpful to you all. So as many of you know, Georgetown Climate Center was established to serve as a resource to federal, state, and local policymakers, and we work at the intersection of state and federal climate policy because certainly with respect to climate change and transportation, state and federal government actions are really tightly connected. And that is even especially true when it comes to transportation investments like deploying EV charging stations across the country. And so that's one reason I'm really on the webinar today to share this eDrive planning tool, which we think can be a really helpful resource, as Sarah mentioned, to inform discussions between policymakers, local communities, and other stakeholders when they're considering priority locations for EV fast charging infrastructure investments. But before we demonstrate the eDrive, I did want to provide a little bit of context, both about where this tool came from, as well as the moment of opportunity right now for EV charging infrastructure planning, which Sarah was alluding to. As you've all seen, world leaders are gathered right now in Glasgow for COP26, and the urgency of the moment right now to address the climate crisis, frankly, couldn't be more clear on the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions dramatically. We know that we need to tackle the transportation sector, which is the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions in the US and an increasing source globally, as well as the source of deadly air pollution, which is concentrated in low-income communities and communities of color. Converting our vehicle fleet to electric cars, trucks, and buses in conjunction with continuing to clean up our power sector can certainly improve air quality and help us to meet our climate goals. And on the next slide, we'll show one of the critical strategies for accelerating this shift to electric vehicles, which is providing accessible, convenient, and reliable EV charging infrastructure across the country. Now, through early federal investments, state and local actions, utility engagement, a lot of progress has been made. I'm showing on the map here from US Department of Energy, the approximately 5,500 public fast charging stations across the country, including Tesla stations, which have a total of about 20,000 plugs. However, a suite of recent analyses are all showing that more charging infrastructure is going to be needed in order to meet our climate and electrification goals. And near-term investment is going to be particularly needed along highway corridors, outside of the major metropolitan areas where much of the charging infrastructure is currently located, as well as in communities that have been underserved by the transportation system and overburdened by pollution. This national development of an EV charging infrastructure network is certainly a significant undertaking, and it's going to require robust partnerships and collaborations along with effective planning in order to make sure that we're deploying this infrastructure effectively and equitably. So on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about the opportunity we have right now with the potential for significant federal investment in EV charging, both from the bipartisan infrastructure bill that the Senate, along with EVs that's currently included in the Build Back Better Act, which is under negotiation. Now, this would significantly exceed the scale of federal investment that we've seen to date. And closely connected with this federal action is the role that state and local governments are going to have in planning and deploying these charging stations. But fortunately, this federal-state partnership can build from a long history of states and cities across the US really being leaders on innovative climate policies, including related to electric vehicles. And states in particular have implemented some innovative policies like the Advanced Clean Cars program developed by California and adopted by states across the country, incentive programs for vehicles and charging infrastructure, funding for community-led electric mobility projects that can expand access and advance equity, and policies to electrify medium and heavy-duty vehicles in order to reduce diesel pollution. In addition to these individual state policies, I think a really interesting phenomenon is that states are working together to plan for and deploy EV charging infrastructure at the regional level. And on the next slide, I want to describe some of these regional partnerships around the country, which is what was the genesis for the eDrive tool. So states are coordinating infrastructure investment, including working to electrify highway corridors. There are some long-standing efforts like the West Coast Electric Highway on the Pacific Coast, which combined early fast charging corridor deployment with some compelling branding and consumer awareness efforts. The Rev West collaboration in the Intermountain West by 8 governors, which has done some geographic corridor planning and worked to build out consistency between these states. There's a newly announced Rev Midwest MOU of 5 Midwest Great Lakes states that was just announced in September, and collaborations in the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic. There are also active partnerships in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, including the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is a collaboration of transportation, energy, and environment agencies from the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and Southeast states from Maine to North Carolina. And this group has collaborated for many years on policies to reduce transportation emissions in this region. And one of the earliest and ongoing areas of collaboration was on electric vehicles and charging infrastructure, including with a specific focus on electric vehicle corridor planning. And that work has included engaging with the Federal Highway Administration's Alternative Fuel Corridors program and developing regional EV charging infrastructure inventories and mapping applications. To support this cross-state and regional planning effort, as the facilitator of the Transportation and Climate Initiative, Georgetown Climate Center, working with MJ Bradley and Associates and in collaboration with this group of states, developed a regional EV charging infrastructure planning tool, which I'll show on the next slide. So as I mentioned, this regional planning for EV charging can be very impactful. There's the obvious geographic connectivity and close economic and business connections between states. And so it's important to provide a consistent and seamless experience for drivers using electric vehicles. So to enable more effective cross-state and regional planning, as well as to support some of the individual statewide planning efforts in this region, we developed the Regional EV Charging Infrastructure Location Identification Toolkit, or ILIT, for the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. The ILIT is designed to allow state policymakers and others both to better understand the current fast charging infrastructure network that's in this region, as well as to identify priority locations for new EV charging infrastructure development. This tool was developed to analyze highway exits along priority corridors, and you may be familiar with that earlier version of the tool, which you can see on the slide here on the left. But this summer, the ILIT was upgraded and expanded to now be a statewide analysis of EV fast charging infrastructure. And for those who are working in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region, we certainly encourage you to use the ILIT, which offers a suite of modeling and mapping tools and will continue to be updated regularly with new data to support charging infrastructure planning efforts in this region moving forward. But now I'm excited to share how, working with our colleagues at MJ Bradley and Associates, we were able to build from this work with the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states and apply the analytical framework that was developed for the ILIT to a new nationwide tool, the eDrive. And it's my pleasure to hand things over to Grace Van Horn from MJ Bradley and Associates, an ERM company, to provide an overview of the eDrive, which can inform regional, state, and local planning for more equitable and informed investments in electric vehicle fast charging infrastructure across the country. Over to you, Grace.
Thanks so much, Matthew. And thanks to Georgetown Climate Center for their kind of continued support of this work and to Ceres for hosting us today. So I'm going to run through a quick series of slides that provides a bit of an overview of how eDrive works, some of the data behind it, but I'll do this quickly so that we can then move right into the demonstration that my colleague Luke will run for you all, because I think that's one of the best ways to really see the capability and function of eDrive. So as we've talked about a number of times today, eDrive is a highly customizable interface to support a diverse set of users and produce results that reflect a wide range of priorities. And it covers 99.5% of populated census tracts across the US. It's a very data-driven tool, and it considers a variety of metrics that we'll talk about in more detail, but it includes all publicly available fast chargers in the US, effectively all non-local roadways, so this is interstates, highways, arterials, collectors, and their corresponding vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, which is about 2.8 trillion VMT, or about 90% of total annual VMT, and over 1 million commercial locations and other points of interest. So it really draws together a lot of data. Next slide, please. So this online tool offers customizable data metrics based primarily on data to allow the user to rank the best locations, or the locations that may be most suitable for new charging infrastructure, and based on unique user priorities. So eDrive allows users to assess, rank, and then visualize those potential infrastructure locations using those metrics that can be aligned with regional, state, local business priorities. The importance of each of these metrics can be weighted to create scenario-specific results, and then can be dynamically presented and mapped, which really allows the user to quickly and easily compare across scenarios. The tool can be refined to focus on only a specific region, a state, a county, a metro area, or key transportation corridors. It can also be used to look at just those areas that currently are overburdened with transportation and other air pollution. And the tool overall, we believe, can really help inform discussions between a wide range of stakeholders, such as policymakers, communities, charging developers, utilities, and others. So next slide, please. The tool, as I mentioned, provides the ability to weight and prioritize a variety of metrics. And so I'll talk through a little bit of what those are here, and then on the following slides, we'll kind of visualize some of those data. But essentially, there are kind of these 6 key factors. The first, and all of these are things that one might consider in where to site new fast charging infrastructure. So the first is the proximity to existing charging infrastructure. This can be looked at with a variety of inputs across a variety of plug types, so whether or not to include Tesla stations, for example. And there are 2 different metrics here. There's the distance to the nearest DCFC station from a given location, and also the density of stations around an area. Both metrics can be important when thinking about whether or not an additional station might be needed in an area. The second is traffic volume. A couple different ways of looking at essentially the number of cars on the roads that are driving through or around a census tract. Third is commercial activity. So this includes both commercial establishments like restaurants and shops and stores, and also points of interest, so recreation centers, parks, that sort of thing. Population density is simply the density of folks living in a census tract. Home charging access is a metric that we've developed to approximate the availability of home charger access. And this is based on essentially the prevalence of multi-unit dwelling residences. So we assume that some portion of folks who live in single family residences could have access to home charging access, a smaller portion in moderate sized multi-unit dwellings, and even smaller portion in the larger multi-unit dwellings. And then finally, there are a number of equity considerations included that we'll highlight in the demonstrations, but it allows a user to further refine the area being considered by qualified opportunity zones and or US EPA EJ screen. So the next slides that we can move to talk through or just kind of show what some of these data look like. So on the proximity to existing charging, here you can see the existing network that Matthew also showed on a previous slide. And we're starting to get at this density question. So where there are actual stations across the country, green is higher density, red is lowest density, and yellow is everywhere in between. Next slide, please. This next slide shows traffic volume across the region, again, with yellow being less traffic and red being higher traffic, as you would expect. You see the highest density around urban areas, but also quite a bit on kind of main thoroughfares and throughways that are connecting those urban areas. And then the final slide to walk through here is the density of commercial activity. I think this is a fun way of looking at kind of where there are things that are clustered by census tract across the country. Next slide, please. So just as a bit of a navigation before we jump into the demonstration, the tool is designed to be very user-friendly and rather intuitive. The jumping off point is this main dashboard, and there are 4 main sections or components of the model. The first is determining those analysis parameters, so the geographic scope that one is interested in, the plug type filters, those sorts of things to be sure that we're utilizing the right data in the right areas. The second are equity considerations. So this allows the user, again, to further refine the area, say within a state, to only look at those census tracts that meet a certain threshold of an EJ screen index or are qualified opportunity zones. Then the user enters in a metric weighting. And this is really kind of where the magic happens, where the user can modify the results to reflect the appropriate balance of priorities. And this is where the user can also run a number of different scenarios for comparison. And then the results are shown in rankable and exportable as well for additional analysis. Also, the tool is split into a variety of regions just to keep it running smoothly that are shown here at the bottom. Next slide. So I wanted to run through this side-by-side comparison before we jump into the demonstration about the results, just to kind of emphasize how changing these metric weightings can really have an impact on the results. So here we're looking at the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania on the left. This weighting really highlights those areas with high traffic volume and commercial activity, or what we might think of as charging demand. So you can see the orange is the higher suitable tracks, the blue is the essentially less suitable tracks based on this set of metric weightings. So the orange areas are those that are largely around urban centers. And as you might expect with a higher commercial activity and traffic volume. Now, switching to the right, all we've done here is change the weighting and now are more highly weighting the proximity metrics. So this is looking more at areas that are gaps in the existing charging network. And you can see actually that this really flips where now the orange or more suitable locations under this scenario are those that are maybe more rural or suburban and further away from some of those main thoroughfares. One thing that I will point out though, and this kind of gets at the possibility of using this for scenario analysis, it's a little small potentially, but you can see on the left, the first, the highest ranked track is in Berks County, Pennsylvania, tract 111. You can actually see that's listed as, I believe, yes, 7th on the right. So even though these cases at a whole look quite different, actually you can see that some of the same tracks still rise to the top across the 3,000 that are being ranked here to really kind of show that you might have some no regrets options to look into even across these two very different scenarios. So with that, I'll pause and maybe we can move into the demonstration and pass it over to Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Grace. And before we move into the demonstration section and pass it off to Luke, we do have a couple of questions from the audience that I think would be good to address right now. Our first question is, how often is the density map of charging stations updated as more charging stations are added?
Roughly quarterly. So quite frequently, because we recognize, and I'm sure that the question asker understands this too, that's changing very quickly. So it's really important to keep that data fresh.
Great. And then a clarification question about the difference between the eDrive tool and how that is different from NREL's EVI Pro or EVI Lite tool, since they're both, since the EVI Pro tool is projection related.
That's a great question. So we actually think that these tools can really work together. They're asking two very related but different questions. So the EVI Pro or Pro Lite tool asks, how much charging do you need? So if you enter in a number of assumptions about vehicle mixes and ratios of plugs to vehicles and that sort of thing, it'll give you some numbers about how much charging you need. Then we believe our tool says, well, then where should you put that charging infrastructure?
That is great. Okay, thank you. And then one more question. Through the eDrive tool, is there any use of EV registration data as a factor, or are you considering adding that as a data layer?
That's another great question. And potentially we could return to that in the discussion and Q&A at the end, because certainly part of our goal in this conversation and in developing this tool in general is to ensure that it meets user needs. And that's absolutely data that we think we could add as an additional factor. It's not currently in the tool.
Okay, great. And I think we're going to cover one more question here and then move on to the demonstrations so we can ensure we have enough time. But also relating to additional data that you may add to the tool in the future. Have you considered adding level 2 chargers to the mix rather than just the DCF chargers that are DCFC that are considered right now?
Yeah, another great question. And I might give almost the exact same answer as before, which is that certainly is a strong candidate for adding to future versions of this. I'll say that kind of as Matthew spoke about the kind of the development of this tool over time started as more of a corridor focused and kind of that interregional focus, thus the focus on DCFC charging. But as we have moved it to be fully inclusive of all areas, we believe that it has shifted to be more useful for some of that community-based charging needs. And we think that including L2 could be another great option in the future.
All right, great. Thank you, Grace. And thank you all for those questions. So with that, let me pass it over to Luke to share his screen and walk you all through some scenarios we thought you may be interested in.
Great, thank you. All right, so this is reloading. So before I start the demos, I do want to very quickly want to highlight a couple of the supplementary resources that are available on the dashboard landing page, so the eDrive landing page. So these 3 buttons at the top, these light green, blue buttons, provide a user guide and the charging stations and census tracts that are included in the current analysis. So I do encourage using the user guide. There are some functionalities of the tool that we're not going to have time to get into with these demos, and there are some inputs that the user guide provides a little bit more insight and information on. Related to a question that was just answered about how often the fast charging infrastructure is updated in this analysis, we did update everything, so it's yesterday, so everything is kind of as current as possible for this demo. But moving forward, it will be generally, as Grace mentioned, a quarterly update. So I'm going to jump to the first region in which the region in which the first scenario is located. Before I actually start changing inputs, I do want to preface these demos with a couple of comments. The first, which this won't be news to the people who are familiar with this tool and the Tableau dashboard formats of this, is that there can be a small lag as inputs are changed. So I'll try to minimize the pause in between input changes, but it is working. Please be patient. The second is that the orange tracks, I'll make this full screen so it's a little easier to see. The orange census tracts and all these different areas or census tracts indicate a high relative suitability or potential need for fast charging development compared to that of the blue areas. But a very important caveat and reminder is that these suitability rankings are specific only to the filters, inputs, and metric weightings that are active. The rankings of any given tract, any specific tract, can change significantly depending on the geographic scope or user priorities. So results should always be interpreted with those in mind. And if they're ever delivered or presented, the results should always be accompanied by the scenario's parameters and active inputs. So there's a decent amount going on with each dashboard, and this is kind of a dashboard that's consistent across the different regions. Just to give a quick orientation of the 4 segments that Grace already discussed. The first area is the analysis parameters. So this is defining the geographic scope. It's also determining which plug types and which fast charging stations are included, whether that's everything or everything excluding Tesla stations. We then have equity considerations and filters associated with those. The metric weighting segment or component of the tool corresponds with the different priorities and the different metrics that are included in the analysis. And then we have the results section on the right side, which show some of the specific tract rankings. So the first scenario that we want to demonstrate reflects an analysis that aims to fill gaps in the existing fast charging network along major interstates and highways. So in other words, we want to identify areas along these roadways, these specific roadways that may need additional charging infrastructure to further support or enable corridor travel. This use case may be most relevant for interstate or highway authorities, charging network providers, or other organizations planning to develop fast charging corridors, or state transportation agencies that could benefit or use assistance to determine how state funding programs to build charging infrastructure are prioritized or allocated. So in this scenario, we're first going to define the geographic scope. This is kind of the first step usually of most scenario analyses in this tool. So we're going to zoom in really on just Georgia and South Carolina initially. As I said, there's a bit of a lag. So Georgia and South Carolina, because we are specifically looking to fill gaps in the roadway, in major roadways, we're going to use the proximity to interstates or highways filter to look only at census tracts that are within 1 mile of such corridors. So as this changes and it kind of redefines the geographic scope, we're only looking at areas that are near corridors. So we have I-95 and I-75, and then some east-west corridors of I-85, I-20, I-26, or I-16, and a couple others as well. So after we've defined the geographic scope, we're going to jump to the metric weighting component for this scenario, and we need to change those metrics to reflect the priorities of this scenario. So the default weights currently prioritize the demand metrics a bit more, so the traffic volume and nearby activity. But for this scenario, we want to heavily weight the proximity metrics instead, so the distance and port density metrics, to ensure that the tracks that are far away from existing charging stations are prioritized. So as I change this, keep in mind that I'm not zeroing out or removing the consideration of other metrics. They're still active and being considered, but the priority metrics are the most important, and they, in this case, will be the proximity metrics. So as these inputs change and as the tool recalculates the suitability rankings for this scenario, the colors of the tracks will change to generally show more orange as you move farther away from metro areas, which is where most existing charging is located. So these blue areas are typically around the metro areas, and as Matthew talked about, that's kind of where most of the existing infrastructure is located. And as you move farther away from them, there aren't as many stations. So I'm going to zoom in on just one corridor to highlight, and to also highlight how sometimes significant it can be and important it is to account for interregional or interstate analysis when informing development, especially when looking at corridor charging. So I zoomed into I-85, which is a roadway that runs approximately 150 miles between Atlanta, which is in the bottom left corner, to Greenville, South Carolina, in the upper right corner. And although there are actually a couple of fast charging stations in the middle of that corridor, I'll let this refresh. It's kind of around the Georgia-South Carolina state border. There are a couple areas along this corridor that still kind of have gaps in that network and have a potential for additional charging. So for instance, the area kind of in between Clemson and Anderson on the South Carolina side is going to have some potential for new charging to kind of fill the gap in between where there's an existing charging station kind of at the border and Greenville. And similarly, kind of the midpoint between the Georgia-South Carolina state border and Atlanta, kind of down here by Commerce and Hazleton, Georgia, has a similar gap that may need additional charging. For the results, along with this visualization, this type of visualization, this is more of a general and not scenario specific takeaway, but you can get more census tract specific information by hovering your cursor over a specific tract, which will generate a pop-up box with information. So the information that it provides are some identification information. So where the tract is located, the census tract ID, and then some further insight into that tract's metric data. So it provides a little bit more information on the metrics that are really driving that specific tract's ranking in any given scenario. So although this scenario covers a pretty big area, I'm going to jump to another scenario to show an analysis that is performed in a much smaller area and with very different priorities. So I'm going to jump to the, let's see, I actually can't access the tabs at the top because of this. So I'll go to the Midwest, and I'm going to look at a specific metro area, in this case, Milwaukee, to perform a much different analysis. And in this case, we're going to look at an attempt to determine where charging infrastructure can be developed with the intention of increasing local and community access to charging. So in other words, rather than prioritizing highway and corridor travel and through traffic, this scenario is attempting to identify areas that may enable or support charging for more local and residential use. And so this use case is a potentially very different potential user, and it's likely more relevant for metro planning organizations, state and city planners, EV commissions, electric utilities that may service the area, public engagement forums such as equity advisory bodies, and other locally focused or community-driven organizations. So there are a few different ways to really identify or select a specific metro area. These filters are all dynamic and are impacted by those that are active. Alternatively, we can just go directly to, in this case, Milwaukee. And so we will see just the census tracts in the Milwaukee metro area. We can further define the geographic scope to maybe something that reflects only census tracts in the most population dense areas, which happen to occur in Milwaukee County, kind of where Milwaukee proper is located. So we'll zoom in a bit on that. But we need to change the metric weighting of this to reflect the priorities of this new scenario. So currently, the metrics are reflective of the previous scenario and the gap filling scenario with a proximity prioritization. In this case, the priorities of this scenario are mainly linked to the demographic metrics, so the population density and access to home charging. So we will change these to something that reflects that priority that's more appropriately. So again, as these rankings recalculate, the orange tracks will generally reflect areas with higher population density and low access to home charging, especially. And just as Grace mentioned with how the access to home charging is calculated, this is a function of the population share or the residency of multi-unit dwellings in the area, with kind of the assumption that the larger and more unit dwelling that someone resides in, the lower chance that they will have to have access to a home charger, and so the more beneficial a public charging station will be. So we can further define the scope with some equity consideration filters. And so I'm going to first look at this, the first filter within this component, which is the designated qualified opportunity zones, which are federally designated areas and are generally economically distressed communities in which new investments may be eligible for preferential tax treatment. And so I will apply this to focus only on those zones. And because this filter in these designated areas do account for income and low income communities, there is some overlap with these areas and the areas that have high EJ index values that are determined by EPA's EJ screen tool. So the kind of the following or subsequent equity consideration filters, which leads me to the next and last scenario, which focuses more on equity considerations. But before I get to that, I do want to just reiterate that the analysis is rerunning. Every time an input is changed, the analysis is rerun and the rankings are regenerated to only account for the universe of census tracts that are that meet the criteria of all of the different filters that are active. So in this case, these census tracts are not being compared against census tracts that are not qualified opportunity zones. They're only being compared against each other to provide kind of this close to an apples to apples comparison as each input is changed. So for the last scenario, I'm going to expand the scope a bit and kind of zoom back out a little to include the entirety of the Milwaukee and Chicago metro areas. So ultimately, this will span 3 states, so Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana. So quite a large area. But this scenario, the objective is to focus primarily on areas that may have overburdened communities, underserved communities, or comparatively poor air quality and high pollution burden. So by using these equity consideration filters, this tool can very quickly integrate EPA EJ screen data to visualize areas and help inform more equitable development planning. Just as a quick note for those not familiar with EJ screen, it's EPA's environmental justice mapping and screening tool that combines demographic and environmental indicators to characterize and identify overburdened communities. And we recognize that different areas and different states have different definitions of underserved communities and have a different framework and approach to kind of identify those areas. We applied EJ screen data because it provides a kind of a nationally consistent approach, but additional analysis that's more specific to a region can also be done, and the region-specific definitions can absolutely be incorporated as well. So this scenario that I'm going to get to is it's likely relevant to the previous group of users, or this group of users that the previous scenario is most targeted toward, but it can also be useful for fleet managers, whether that's corporate or utility, that are looking to electrify existing fleets in the area by helping inform where fleets should be initially electrified. So in this example, we're going to apply filters to the ozone and the respiratory hazard indices, which are the most relevant index values we've included to transportation-related emissions and pollution, but also account for communities with low income and high population shares of people of color, because it does, it's kind of a combination. Both of these indices, index values, are a combination of ozone concentration and respiratory hazard with the demographic index, which is a kind of a cumulative EJ index that EJ screen has generated, which accounts for income and people of color population share. So I'm going to change these, the threshold of this to 95. You can also use the slide bar to do that. But what this means when I'm changing these thresholds is that only areas with index values equal to or above the state's 95th percentile are shown and included in the ranking analysis. So if you noticed, the initial number of census tracts that were included were in the several hundred. I think actually there might have been a couple thousand, but now that we're focused only on these overburdened communities and with high pollution burden, that number of census tracts that are included in the analysis has gone down significantly. The metric weightings have remained the same. They're still focused on local and residential use, but now just a different subset of census tracts. So of course, this can be adjusted in a lot of different ways, further defined by geography to maybe more granularly inform users, because I know this is a pretty significant area. And the reason that maybe focusing a little bit more on a specific area is useful is and can be informational for users such as fleet managers to determine equitable locations for vehicle electrification is because identifying local or state-specific incentives and opportunities is important, should probably be considered to help make final decisions. Just as a kind of as an add-on to that is, as discussed in the previous scenario, the application of the opportunity zone filter is actually a decent, at least an initial screening tool for this type of exercise, because it does indicate areas that may be eligible for some preferential tax treatment under new investment and new development. So if this is applied, this is only focusing on high polluted areas, but it's a even smaller subset that is a designated opportunity, a qualified opportunity zone as well. So that kind of concludes the demos. These were just a selection of potential use cases. We're obviously always looking to incorporate more data and parameters to enable scenarios that may not currently be covered by eDrive, but I will now hand it back to Matthew to talk about some next steps.
Thanks so much, Luke. Yeah, really appreciate you providing that demonstration. And I think it's great that we're able to show the sort of real-time dynamic nature of this tool, which I think can be particularly useful in informing conversations or planning meetings, whether that's at the state or local level. And I think one of the real values that is added by this eDrive. So thanks very much for doing that in real time. Really interesting results, and can really show how results change based on the specific user-generated parameters and metrics and filters that are emphasized. Yeah, as you mentioned, those are really just a few of the potential use cases of the eDrive, and I think there's a lot of other examples where it could be directly applied, whether that's a statewide EV fast charging infrastructure gap assessment that's not just looking at a corridor, but a whole statewide analysis, or supporting a public utility commission proceeding or electric vehicle planning process, and many more. And as Luke mentioned, I think both of us at Georgetown Climate Center and NJ Bradley and Associates are really eager and excited to discuss with you all any additional use cases that you'd like to see supported by this tool moving forward. Before we shift to the Q&A responses, I did want to speak a little bit more to this opportunity to continue developing the eDrive as a resource moving forward. I think we're really, as I just said, in input and on suggestions for this tool, but in particular, interested in input related to the equitable deployment of fast charging infrastructure. As we mentioned a few times, the development of the eDrive and the eyelet have been very iterative processes, and they've evolved and been expanded and updated over time. And we are very much looking to further develop this tool into what could be a more useful resource for community-based organizations or others who are engaged in planning for or assessing equitable transportation investments in charging infrastructure, including the potential upcoming federal investments as they relate to the Justice 40 initiative. As you saw in the demonstration, we have included these US EPA EJ screen filters, which I think are helpful illustrative filters to show how you can relay data from this nationally consistent database, the NATA diesel particulate matter filter. But we are interested in working directly with equity-focused organizations as we continue to develop this tool to make sure that we're including the right metrics and filters right there in the interface that can support that kind of work. And additionally, we're excited to continue updating this as we move forward. There's a lot of work happening in this space right now, including the development of the forthcoming climate and economic justice screening tool that's being developed by the White House Council on Environmental Quality right now, along with a number of other updates. So with that, I think we're really excited to hear your feedback and reactions. I see a number of questions in the chat box or the question Q&A box that I'm excited to dig into right now. And excited to continue to engage with you all moving forward. So with that, I'll hand things over to Sarah to start the Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Matthew and Luke, for walking through all those various scenarios. We have a lot of excitement about the tool, a lot of questions, so we definitely will not be able to get to all of them today, but we will certainly try to get to as many as possible, and you can feel free to follow up with any of us. Sorry, I'll turn on my video. You can feel free to follow up with any of us. Our contact information is on the last slide after the webinar. So first things first, people have a lot of questions about user groups and how particular user groups can use the tool. So is the tool free to use, and does it require subscription or something, or a purchase?
That's an easy one and a fun one to answer. It is free to use. In the slides and in the link that you received for the registration, you should have a link to access the tool. It's currently located on the MJ Bradley website. So we can also ensure that we follow up with attendees with that link as well. But we encourage you to jump in and check it out. It does require a quick registration, just so we can ensure that you're notified of updates, but it is.
Great, thank you, Grace. And a little bit more of an in-depth question around transit and traffic volume. So just to read the question from the person who asked it, traffic volumes are naturally larger in denser areas with great economic activity. Poor and BIPOC communities generally use transit more than SOVs. On its face, it seems like this tool would naturally overly provide infrastructure where mass transit or other options would be more appropriate from a transportation operations perspective, but also from an environmental perspective. So the question is, how can users account for other modal options, or like micromobility transit, that therefore use eDrive for multimodal planning? And I will pass that off to Matthew first.
Sure, it's a great question. I think important to sort of caveat the tool as a whole is that it is talking about vehicle electrification, which is of course a subset of the broader low carbon transportation investments, including expanded transit and safer biking and pedestrian access, which are all really important and critical to providing greater access to communities. And even within transportation electrification, this tool in its current form is really focused on passenger cars and trucks. And so it's if you're a community that's more focused on reducing diesel pollution, you may be more interested in electrifying medium and heavy duty vehicles that are right now primarily charged at depots. So recognizing the limitations of sort of where this tool sits within the broader suite of transportation planning resources, I think there are some ways that you could use it in its current form to answer some questions. For example, if you're interested in some kind of a community-based ride sharing or electric car sharing program, you could potentially look to identify communities either that have low access to home charging or where there is significant population density. There are some other, but with limited access to charging as a way of potentially prioritizing those types of investments. But it is true, I think, that the sort of access to vehicle ownership or vehicle registrations, those kind of statistics, I think, could cut either way as far as doing an equity assessment. But I think in general, just to reemphasize that all of the metrics in this tool are very customizable. So it's very much up to the user to toggle them in a way that sort of meets your particular needs. And we'll be happy to follow up individually to talk through if there are other ideas on how this could better fit that use case. Grace, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
No, I think that's a great summary, and I co-sign all of that. I would also add that kind of in thinking about this tool in general, we very much have intended to frame it as a bit of a scoping analysis, right? So this can be a first way to maybe narrow down some opportunities, or once selecting those priorities that Matthew mentioned that I think are really important. Once there are some areas that have risen to the top, then kind of taking those and applying additional filters and considerations that aren't necessarily included in here. And transit access, among others, could be something that a user would apply separately.
I also want to quickly add that the concern that it might overprovide infrastructure kind of in metro areas, the traffic volume metric is a combination of both vehicle miles traveled in and nearby the area in the analysis, but also annual average daily traffic. And so roadways, kind of the maximum traffic demand in the area. And so the big roadways are, even though there's some loops around metro areas, and the major trafficked roadways, just from an AADT standpoint, are going to be those major corridors that are not necessarily located in city centrals.
Great, thanks everyone. We do have also a lot of questions about data sources and the availability in the future of new data layers. So let's start with a question about whether or not you're planning to factor in or incorporate different speeds of DC fast charging, for example, 25, 50 kilowatts, et cetera. And then also if you're planning to incorporate the utilization of existing charging points.
So it's really exciting to see all of these questions and recommendations come in for additional data, because I think our primary goal with this is for it to be used and useful. And so look forward to incorporating many of these recommendations, we hope, in future iterations. As to those specific recommendations, the capacity of the charging stations is not yet included, although I'd imagine that would fit very well within potentially the existing metric of plug density, thinking about kind of maybe capacity density rather than just port. As for utilization of existing stations, I'm not sure who the questioner was on that. If you are aware of the availability of that data, my understanding is that's rather closely guarded by the network operators. But certainly that would be a really interesting factor to include if we were able to.
Another question relating to that is whether or not you're considering incorporating any utility data in the future, whether that be grid capacity restrictions, et cetera, which I assume is a similar answer of that is closely guarded information.
Yeah, so we're starting to see more of that available on a pretty ad hoc basis as various states are requiring the release of, capacity maps and that sort of thing, in large part to inform electrification initiatives. So we'd really be interested in exploring that maybe on more of a pilot and kind of local basis as that data is available. Unfortunately, it's not included in the current model. But again, of course, that's a huge factor.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do one more question in this area and then move on to one more before I think we have to wrap it up. But another big question was about whether you were planning to incorporate or consider the needs of medium and heavy duty vehicles to the eDrive tool in the future.
So I kind of similar, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but certainly we would be thrilled to do that. I think in many ways it would rely on some of the similar data, but it would probably be best served as a separate model, just because we'd want to include, the appropriate traffic data and probably some additional refinements there. But certainly we feel like this sort of thing could be useful. Sarah, I think earlier, or Matthew earlier mentioned, the focus on depot charging too. So I think the use case would also probably be slightly different there, but we'd be really excited to explore how to make that work.
All right, great. Let's try to do two more questions. Is there a way to view and plan across multiple regions, for instance, coordinating charger deployment between New York and Massachusetts?
Yeah, so that's a tough one with how this is set up right now. In order to make the tool kind of usable within the platform that it's on, we had to split it up into regions, and unfortunately that does, for example, split New York and Massachusetts. It also, sadly for me, growing up in Minnesota, splits Minnesota from Wisconsin. So there is an opportunity to create kind of a user-specific collection of states, I think is the short answer there. Not within the existing tool that's available right now, but that's a fairly simple fix and something that we would be happy to explore with folks.
Okay, let's try to get in one more question. That's pretty quick. A few commenters recommended removing CHAdeMO chargers from the tool. Do you have any response to that?
You can. So that's, I'm happy to say that is one of the plug type filters that so users can filter out Tesla, can filter out CHAdeMO. can just focus on CHAdeMO if you own a Nissan, I guess.
It's actually, to jump in, this version is actually, you cannot separate CHAdeMO from the SAE and Tesla. So it's either SAE and CHAdeMO or SAE, CHAdeMO, and Tesla.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So then the answer to that would be yes, that would make a lot of sense to do.
In the regional tool that we initially developed with Georgetown for the kind of the Mid-Atlantic and Northeastern states, that option is available. It kind of ran out of space for this.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like we are at the top of the hour. Jess, if you can pull up the last thank you slide with our contact information, that would be great. So a huge thank you to our amazing speakers today, and thank you all so much for joining us for this webinar. Again, please reach out with any follow-up questions, or if we weren't able to get to your questions, we are happy to hop on the phone and discuss those. So thank you again, and I hope you have a great Wednesday. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.